now the next in the series, he teaches in another synagogue, but now in Capernaum on the Sabbath. In Matthew, it totally skips this. Just says, and Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all manner of sickness and all manner of disease among the people, and his fame went throughout all Syria. So it's not in Matthew, so I'll just ignore that for now. Mark goes on, verse 21 of chapter 1 of Mark, and they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath day he entered into the synagogue and taught, and they were astonished at his doctrine, and he taught them as one that had authority, and not as the scribes. And there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. Okay, so he teaches in the synagogue, and then he does the exorcism in the synagogue. In Luke, it skips this section as well, but it has one verse that I need to mention. So going way back when he was thrown out of Nazareth, this is verse 30, but he, passing through the midst of them, went on his way, and came down to Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and taught them on the Sabbath days. I did include that whole verse earlier, so I'm not going to include and he taught them on the Sabbath days again. I'm just going to say that this specific day he taught after he called the four. You know, that mention, he taught them on the Sabbath days, I could say that this next teaching on the Sabbath day could be included among these, but this is only one that he does after he calls them. So I'm saying that when it's mentioned in Luke, in verse 31, that was many Sabbath days prior, and then he calls them, and then this Sabbath day is when I'm having this explanation verse in verse 32, that they were astonished at his doctrine, even though they could be astonished all those Sabbath days. Now is when I'm going to include it, because it just makes so much more sense than having this verse before from Luke, before he calls the disciples, and then again after on this specific day. So this phrase, and they were astonished at his doctrine, I'm only going to have that once, and that's going to be now. Starting in Mark, the phrase, and they went into Capernaum, because at this point he was by the Sea of Galilee, which is near Capernaum. There might be a portion in Capernaum, but he was already in Capernaum, he living there. Then he went to the Sea of Galilee where they were fishing. Now he's going back into Capernaum, which couldn't be very far, but I'm still going to say it because it's here, and I haven't said this yet. And immediately on the Sabbath day, he entered into the synagogue and taught. Now verse 22 is going to be combined between Mark and Luke. 22 says, and they were astonished at his doctrine. Luke, and they were astonished at his doctrine. So it's both. Okay, Mark and Luke, and they were astonished at his doctrine. Colon. Now Mark, for he taught them as one that had authority. Luke, for his word was with power. That's very different. Okay, so 4 is in both. He taught them as one that had authority. His word was with power. I could say both, just like that. Oh, this is perfect. This verse from Mark, it goes like this. For he taught them as one that had authority, and not as the scribes. So I was thinking if I could just find an and to put after, for he taught them as one that had authority, so that I could add this line from Luke, for his word with power. So I could say, and for his word was with power. Or I could say 4 from both, then from Mark, he taught them as one that had authority, and from Luke, his word was with power. And now I can go right back to Mark, not as the scribes. It's a little bit more of a slap in the face to the scribes. But that's just perfect. Okay, 4 from both. Now just from Mark, he taught them as one that had authority, and now from Luke, his word was with power. Immediately skip right back over to Mark, not as the scribes. This is perfect. And that's where the verse ends in both. Okay. Or I don't know, it's a little awkward saying his word was with power, not as the scribes, without the comma. So I could say, for he taught them as one that had authority, his word was with power, and not as the scribes. Now, I think it's good how it is. So this is actually better. And they were astonished at his doctrine, for his word was with power, and he taught them as one that had authority, and not as the scribes. Now it's good.